We stopped with 7.13 last time, so we're going to continue to 7.14 and finish this chapter, and then we'll move into chapter 8 and see how far we can get in about an hour or so. So we had been talking about the anatomy of the skeletal system and bones, and we're up to the thoracic cage. So the thoracic cage does provide support for the whole thoracic cavity, and keep in mind within the thoracic cavity you have the heart and the lungs, the thymus, and a few other thoracic cavity organs that are of lots of importance. And the thoracic cage is composed of the vertebrae of the thoracic cage, the ribs and the sternum, and the ribs and the sternum do form the rib cage. And in addition to providing protection for the organs, these bones are attachment sites for muscles that are going to be involved with your breathing, with maintaining your position of your vertebral column, and for moving your pectoral girdles and your upper limbs. So if we look closer and we start with the sternum, the manubrium is that center bone in front of your chest, the anterior. The manubrium is the top part of the sternum. It's a trapezoid-shaped superior portion. The body is the majority of the sternum. This is attached to the inferior surface of the manubrium. And then at the very bottom is a very small piece called the xiphoid process. It's attached to the inferior portion of the body. And notice that your ribs do attach to the sternum through the costal cartilages. If we look at the ribs, vertebrosternal ribs 1 through 7 connect to the sternum by the individual costal cartilages, and these are the true ribs. Ribs 8 through 10 are called vertebrochondral ribs, and they connect to the sternum via shared costal cartilages. So they connect to a cartilage that connects to another cartilage. Then your vertebral ribs 11 and 12, they have no connection to your sternum, and we call them floating ribs. Altogether, ribs 8 through 12 are called false ribs. Looking at individual ribs, you have a costal groove on the inferior border. This marks the path of the nerves and the blood vessels. And then the shaft is the major portion. It's the tubular body of the rib. And then the angle is where the shaft curves towards your sternum. Coming around the angle, you hit the head or capitulum. This is the vertebral end of the rib where the rib articulates with your vertebral column. And specifically, it articulates at the articular facets. The tubercle contains articular facets that contact the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. So notice that the ribs do contact your vertebrae at 2 points. Okay, the ribs that articulate with thoracic vertebrae, this is ribs 2 through 9. The head articulates with the costal facets of 2 adjacent vertebrae. You'll notice the tubercular facet of the rib articulates with the transverse costal facet of the inferior vertebra. The superior articular facet of the rib articulates with the superior vertebra. And the inferior articular facet of the rib articulates with the superior costal facet of the vertebra. Ribs 1, 10, 11, and 12, the heads articulate with a single costal facet of the individual vertebrae. The tubercular facets of ribs 1 and 10 attach to the transverse costal facets, and there's no tubercular facets on ribs 11 and 12. Now there's quite a bit of movement within the ribs, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of purpose in this. Both for just general movement of your upper body, but also so that you can breathe. So your typical rib acts like a bucket handle held out to the side horizontally. Pushing down moves the rib inward. Pulling up moves the rib outward. And the movements affect the width and depth of the thoracic cage. This increases or decreases the volume. And this is very important when it comes to your respiration. Up to Module 7.15. The appendicular skeleton includes the limb bones and the pectoral and pelvic girdles. So the appendicular skeleton includes bones of the limbs and the supporting bone girdles that connect the limbs to the trunk. And we'll go through each of these parts. So the pectoral girdle or the shoulder girdle, this joins the arms to the trunk, and each of them consists of the S-shaped clavicle and a broad flat scapula. So the pectoral girdle involves two pairs of bones, four bones altogether, the clavicles and the scapulae. If we look at the clavicle in more detail, it originates at the articulation of the superior lateral border of the manubrium of the sternum, and that's lateral to the jugular notch, and it forms a sternoclavicular joint. The only articulation between the pectoral girdle and the axial skeleton that occurs is right here. The sternal end of the clavicle, this has a pyramid shape. The clavicle curves laterally and posteriorly, then it forms a posterior curve to your scapula. The clavicle articulates with your acromion of your scapula at the clavicular notch, and it forms the acromio-clavicular joint. And stabilizing ligaments attach to the conoid tubercle and the costal tuberosity. The acromial end of the clavicle, this is flatter and broader than the sternal end. It's a rough inferior surface bearing lines and tubercles. If we look at the scapula, you see it has an anterior surface. It forms a smooth, broad triangle. There are three sides. And the parts of the scapula, the markings that we'll mention are important as muscle attachment sites. We have a superior border, a medial border, and a lateral border. The corners of the triangle have the superior angle, the inferior angle, and the lateral angle. And the lateral angle is the location of the glenoid cavity. The subscapular fossa is a depression on the anterior scapular surface. If we look closer at the glenoid cavity, we see a cup-shaped depression, and this is where the scapula articulates with the humerus. This joint would be called the glenohumeral joint. The acromion is a large process that extends laterally. It projects posterior and superior to the glenoid cavity and is continuous with the scapular spine. The coracoid process is right anterior and somewhat inferior to the acromion, but it is superior to the glenoid cavity. The posterior surface of the scapula is convex, has a prominent ridge, and different processes for muscle attachments. The scapular spine, as you see in this picture, is a ridge that crosses the posterior surface of the scapular body. It's continuous with the acromion, and it ends at the medial border of the body. The supraspinous fossa is a depression superior to the scapular spine, and the infraspinous fossa is a region inferior to the scapular spine. Moving on to 7.17, the humerus of the arm articulates with the radius and ulna of the forearm. So looking at the upper limb, consists of the bones of the arm, that's the shoulder to the elbow, that's the humerus. And throughout the beginning of this book anyway, whenever we talk about the arm, we are talking about the upper arm, the humerus. The forearm is the elbow to the wrist. This involves the ulna and the radius. The wrist involves the carpals, and the hands contain the metacarpals and phalanges. Looking closer at the humerus, it's the only bone in the arm, also called the brachium. The shaft expands at the distal end to form the epicondyles, and these provide additional surface area for muscle attachment. So you have the medial epicondyle, you see in this picture at your right, and the lateral epicondyle. The head of the humerus is the proximal end that articulates with the glenoid cavity. The anatomical neck marks the extent of the joint capsule, and as I've mentioned before, it's not really much of a neck, not like down at the femur. And we also have what's called this surgical neck, corresponds to the metaphysis of a growing bone. It's a typical site for fractures. The greater tubercle, as you see in the pictures to the right, are rounded projections on the lateral epiphyseal surface. This establishes lateral contours of the shoulder. And then the lesser tubercle is a smaller projection on the anterior medial surface of the epiphysis. The intertubercular sulcus, also called the intertubercular groove or bicipital groove, is between the greater and lesser tubercles. They're both important muscle attachment sites. A large tendon runs through the groove. Next, the deltoid tuberosity, a large rough elevation on the lateral humeral shaft. And this is an attachment site for the deltoid muscle. The radial groove crosses the inferior end of the deltoid tuberosity and marks the path of the radial nerve. And the radial fossa is a shallow depression on the anterior humeral surface. The condyle is a site where the humerus articulates with the radius at the radiohumeral joint and the ulna at the humeral-ulnar joint. And we divide the condyle into two regions. The capitulum, this is the rounded portion forming the lateral surface. It articulates with the radius. You see this in the picture on your right, smooth area. It's right beside the lateral epicondyle. And then the trochlea, this forms a medial surface. It extends from the olecranon fossa at the posterior surface to the coronoid fossa at the anterior surface. And these depressions accept the projections of the ulna. This is where the U of the ulna fits in. Let's look at the ulna and the radius. They're parallel bones that support the forearm, also called the antebrachium. The shafts are connected by the interosseous membrane of the forearm. And by the way, this interosseous membrane actually forms what we consider a real joint or articulation between these two bones. Not quite like the normal types of joints you think of, but it is a joint or an articulation. We have the proximal radio-ulnar joint. The radial notch on the ulna articulates with the radial head. And the distal radio-ulnar joint, the lateral surface of the head of the ulna articulates with the ulnar notch